Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero. AJ here with a follow-up to the précis, shall we say, of the Requiem lore with a slightly fuller treatment. With the new lore released in the IKRPG Requiem Player's Handbook, and no further, there is only so much that can be fit in that particular book, what with character creation material, Iron Kingdom specific mechanics and items, as well as repackaged setup lore for players who will come to the game without any prior knowledge. Keeping this in mind, there's some lore for each of the titular Iron Kingdoms that builds on the state of play during the Oblivion campaign and the events of the claiming, though a not unreasonable majority of it will be historic information for the benefit of aforementioned new players. And because this is set in the Iron Kingdoms and the focus is generally around the original War Machine factions, information about Iosan is a little thin, hence the approach taken with the previous video, which was, along with the Warcaster NeoMechanika take, rather more in-the-moment thoughts than the typical retrospective view that's usually provided, and what's going to be provided here. In retrospect, it was only a matter of time before the Infernals came, though without the words of the crazed hermit of Henjold, many would never have known. It is only with hindsight that the actions of the enigma that is the old Witch of Cador can be made sense of. And even if we do call the hermit crazed, there is little of what he says that we can deny, however much we may want to. As to the hermit himself, he was a seeker in years past, and while there is little by way of coordination among those who joined that sect, he shared our overriding goals, to wander the world in search of any means, knowledge or lore that might aid first Syra, and then Nisor when he was returned to Ios, in their recovery from a long convalescence. It appears as though he both succeeded and failed. He sought truth and held hope, but he professed finding one and losing the other. If he truly did receive the prophecies that shape his words, it is easy to understand why he abandoned everything in despair, whether his home, his family, his name, and even his very self. We do not know the origin of the hermit's prophecies, for he refuses to say, almost too fearful to remember it. But no matter what transpired before, from this point onwards, he would be a herald of the undoing of Immoren, its unwilling observer. It mattered not what we, his former peers, dreaded. He warned us it would be worse, and that it could not be prevented. The malaise of the Iosan people, from which we had struggled to wrest ourselves, returned acutely, or would have if the hermit's visions imparted to us were more widely known. Now, when stability, if not sanity, has returned to the world, none of his prophecies can be denied by or to anyone. I count myself fortunate that I was far from any gate when the Infernals and their horrors arrived. Gates built in secret by the weak-willed human minions of the Infernals, tempted by the promise of strength and power. Nevertheless, their entrance to our world was sudden, violent and devastating. They wasted no time in reaping souls from whichever unfortunate people were around. Survivors speak of tireless butchery, which is a blessing next to the fate of victims' souls. For humanity, it seemed as though nowhere escaped unscathed. I count myself even more fortunate that I was neither a victim of any Infernalists' machinations, nor part of the vengeance against them. Many humans betrayed their fellow Immories thanks to the contracts made with the Infernals, and it was because of them that the invasion was able to be so complete in its surprise, and so extensive in the destruction that it would ultimately wrought throughout Western Immoren. While it would be easy to place blame equally upon these Infernalists, I cannot condemn them all, for I know that some were preyed upon by the whispers from the abyss when they were unable to decline an offer and acknowledge the price for fulfilling the greatest of their heart's desires. I like to believe that they felt some guilt when the time came to betray their colleagues and countrymen. Just as the Infernalists worked towards the same goal, be it independently or not, the powers of Immoren were forced into alliance against the Infernal invasion, and no nation of the West remained untouched, whether they liked it or not. Even forces from the Nightmare Empire of Crix arrived to aid the armies of mankind. Though some may interpret Lich Lord Asphyxius' actions as a measure of altruism, one would do well to consider his endless ambitions, which have seen him the centre of much of Western Immoren's woes in recent decades. For the first time in a generation, Cador, Signar, and the Protectorate of Menoth were compelled to concede that the greater threat to their existence loomed, that was not each other. Even the Crixians did not unite them as the Infernals did, and such an alliance of the peoples of Western Immoren had not been formed since the rebellion against the Orgoth. Similarly to the east, the Iosans and Skorne, who were locked in a war started by a Skorne invasion past the Iosan peaks, the leaders of these two races came to terms and formed an alliance to confront the Infernals. While this was the mortal response to the infernal threat, the gods of the people of Caen declared their answer in due course as well. Knowing that the presence of the Infernals in Immoren would greatly impact their struggle in the preservation of the souls of their believers, all the pantheons that could dispatched their servants to help protect and safeguard their people and their souls. These were the Archons, the manifestations on Caen of the greatest souls empowered by their gods, given power and purpose anew. Issyria and Nisor were too weak to call their servants in the Veld and the Palace of Laios and bring them to Caen, and likely they were hard-pressed in the defence of that realm. However, godless Archons, those that embodied aspects of the soul or Caen in ways I still do not comprehend, also came to aid against the Infernals. At the time, elves thought these Archons to be from the Veld, for they took forms familiar to us in the monuments to the Divine Court. It was only later that I learned that this was very much not the case. Shortly before the invasion, however, the cult of the Convergence of Cyrus had discovered, by what means I do not know, the designs for an interdimensional portal that would take whoever passed through it to where Cyrus was. To those of us who are not Cyricists, it is unknown where this location was meant to be, only that it is some far-off world beyond Caen, a distance beyond any mortal recognition. When the Infernals learned of this portal, they realized its importance, for it would deprive them of a great many of the souls for which they had come. The price to be paid was fully 2/3 of all souls from humanity, but they would no doubt try to take what others they could, whether it be Elven, Dwarven, Trollkin, Gobber, Ogren, or Skorne. As the Infernals, their mortal servants and horrors descended upon Hengehold, where the portal was constructed, so too did the armies of the Western Immories, and the greatest battle of the war against the Infernals took place, so that as many could cross the portal as possible. Humanity's victory, though supported by the forces from other races, was hard-earned, and among the cost was the destruction of the portal, and with it the means to rebuild it, though not before a great many were seen through to safety. With the Infernal Masters, the commanders of the demonic horde, defeated at Hengehold, the greatest threat was destroyed, but the Infernal and Infernalist menace remained, if scattered throughout the Iron Kingdoms. The fighting would devastate much of Western Immoren, but they were gradually fought back from strongholds throughout the continent, bastions purged of Infernalist presence. There was no rest for the Immories, no matter who or where they were, for the forces of the Infernals were tireless, but eventually they were driven back to the outer abyss where they came from. While the effort was the first instance of unified purpose among the peoples of Western Immoren, it was not without division, for the leading powers of the Protectorate of Menoth transitioned from fighting the Infernals to fighting each other with unfortunate haste. And to the north, the Iosans and Skorne did likewise. Just as the infernal presence at Ios's borders was on the verge of being extinguished, they who were once unwilling allies turned on each other once more, and whatever Lord Girshild Var and Lord Arbiter Hexeris achieved together appeared to go to waste. It barely matters who won in the Protectorate, for the figure that meant the most to the people of that nation, Sovereign Tristan Durant, led them as their new prophet on an exodus far to the south, across the oceans to the lands of the Zoo. Little news has come back from New Ichthia, as the Menite colony there is called, but that the Macarian League is perturbed by their presence can only mean that they do passably well at this time. From what I have studied of the Zuis, perhaps they may come to be accepting of the New Ichthians in a shared god, for as the creations of Menoth, if by another name, they may find solidarity in their shared faith. As to where I once called home, all I know is that I am no longer welcome there, and that the cities of Ios are much changed. The war between Iosans and Skorne was reignited for reasons that are known to none but a few. No matter the cause, it took only a few months for the forces of the Retribution to drive the Eastern Empire back beyond the Bloodstone Desert, and many of the Skorne fortresses dotted throughout the northern half of the marches quickly fell under Iosan control. At the war's conclusion, though, something occurred that would separate Ios itself from the elves that had left my homeland, whether to flee the Infernals, to fight them, or as part of our work to save Syra and Nisor. With the threat seemingly over, returning refugees were inexplicably denied entry at the borders, turned away by soulless sentinels. Some tried to return to their homes despite this, though in the succeeding years I did not hear any news from within Ios, Sheer, or any of the other cities, only of other travellers confronted by the soulless. The rest were rumours, whether of creatures that are the dread of any Iosan, or the fate of the people within. Not all refugees risked the journey back though, and some settlements have formed, whether alongside other refugees in such places as the Rulik freeholds or in the outposts that were once Skorne territory. Concerning rule, they took in many Laerlese who fled when Kador invaded years before, and during the claiming they took in many more, including those of other peoples. These formed freehold villages, adjuncts to the cities around the Arms Deep, populated by displaced humans, elves, urban trollkin, and gobblers, though it is not uncommon to see the dwarves themselves and their Ogren compatriots also establish themselves in these villages. Reasons for such presence are derived as much from pragmatism as altruism. Traders and clan representatives seek profit or the goodwill of the freehold residents in almost equal measure, but other elements of ruling society come and go, including those who seek knowledge instead. Similar settlements to the freeholds already existed in Signar, if in slightly different forms, but these days they have a different feel, and not least because there are many more elves among the human cities than before. Signar has become even more cosmopolitan in the years since after the claiming, if that were even possible, for their acceptance of other faiths has only expanded to the official recognition of the cult of Cyrus and taking in displaced Mennonites from the remains of the neighbouring protectorate. Indeed, such unity, though unprecedented and even protested against in some corners, is welcome as members of the various militant orders work together to root out what remains of infernalism in Western Immoren. Though they are reluctant, the Khadorans help in this effort as well, though the political landscape in that northern nation prevents Empress Ayn from committing to such cooperation as wholeheartedly as she might want. Much of the nobility was discovered to be bound by infernal contracts, and the victory over the invaders from the outer abyss led to their inevitable deaths, whether as casualties of war or from execution afterwards. In many Velosks, power vacuums exist, with the remaining Grand Princes jockeying to claim the pieces for themselves, particularly in the east. This is of concern for the beloved Empress, who must contend with the dual challenges of helping her people recover and ensuring her own base of strength, so those who seek to undermine her imperial power may not do so easily. For more so than in many other nations, Khador's imperial court was rife with corruption and unbridled ambition. It is now down to a precious few loyal nobles to aid Ayn to regain Khador's former glory. Once the target of her imperial ambitions, Lael was almost completely destroyed. What was left of the country after Khador and the Protectorate of Menoth stripped Lael of its independence and sovereignty. What was left of the country after Khador and the Protectorate of Menoth stripped Lael of its independence and sovereignty was almost wiped from the map by Infernals as they swept through Immoren. Their recently crowned queen, Caitlin de la Martin, was almost among the dead of the war, but survived to rule over ruins and Dash, though she hopes that the return of the Order of the Golden Crucible to its old headquarters at the Thunderhead will help revive her ailing country's fortunes. The Order, however, is wary of the Queen's intentions, and the chapter based at Midfast in Ord remains the most influential. Concerning Ord, Caitlin also sought to preserve her own influence by marrying King Bear's grandson, Alvor, but such efforts are of little consequence, for the nobles of Caitlin's court ignore her as they tussle over the remains of their country as it tries to rebuild itself, and her husband ignores her for his mistress and remains in Ord, dismissive towards his duties as king consort. This matters not to Baird himself, who sees this merely as a source of trade opportunities, for he unscrupulously seeks to strengthen Ord as the Infernals devastated his capital with the same indifference as any other city of mankind. Though the unsettling and paradoxical order of Merin's roads remains, a stark contrast to the apparent lawlessness of the country as a whole, especially Five Fingers, which has lost none of its infamy. And for once, the pirates of Ord have little to fear from their undead rivals from Crix, who, in the aftermath of the claiming, have retreated to their accursed ports. But sailors of Immoren are careful nonetheless to still keep an eye out for when the ships of the Nightmare Empire inevitably make their reappearance. Even though the Infernals were defeated and driven away, though, we have not celebrated, nor have there been any laurels to rest upon, because of what was sacrificed and lost to achieve what historians of the future may call victory. Not just that, but it seems the ruins of centuries past stirred, almost as a response to the coming of the Infernals. Whether this was really the case, none can say, but rumours of black ships and the armour of screaming visages do not bode well for Immoren in the years to come.